I come from Ireland. And when you think of religion and Ireland, it's often embarrassing, especially if you think of Northern Ireland, where we have experienced religious violence. My father ran a store. And because he believed that all people are made in the image of God, as a Christian, he nevertheless felt that he should employ equally, as far as he could, across the divided community. He got bombed for it. My brother was nearly killed. So violence has reached our family. Violence that has a religious component. My parents were very unusual because they were Christian without being sectarian. That was very unusual. Secondly, they allowed me to think. That was even more unusual. Although they were convinced of the truth of Christianity, they loved me enough to know that I had to decide for myself. So they didn't only teach me Christianity. They encouraged me to read widely. I can recall, I think I was about 13. And my father handed me a book and I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's a Communist Manifesto. Have you ever read it?" And I said, "No." Well, he said, You ought to know what these people think. Now, my father didn't have an education beyond the age of 14. But he was bright, and he read, and he knew what was good for me. So, the result of that was, when I got to Cambridge, in the middle of the last century, or the one before, somewhere around then, I wasn't full of bias or prejudice. Many of my fellow countrymen, the moment they left home, that was the end of God. Immediately. Because their conviction had never been their own. Because my convictions were my own, and I'd read an enormous amount of stuff, I decided on day one at Cambridge that if Christianity was true, I needed to confess it. And so I did. With the result that in the middle of week one, sitting at dinner, together with my fellow students, a student said to me, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh dear, I'm so sorry. You're Irish. And all you Irish believe in God, and you fight about it." Now, of course, I'd heard that many times, but I realized, you see, that what he was thinking was this. My parents are believers, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, that's 3 generations. So it's Irish genetics. That's it. It's simply a delusion that all Irish people have written into their genes. End of story. And so on that day, I decided that I got a real opportunity in the University of Cambridge to investigate, to get to know people who did not share my worldview, who'd never been to church, whose parents had never been to church, who didn't know anything about Christianity. And I have spent my entire life doing that. Befriending, and I emphasize the befriending people who do not share my worldview. Because I have wanted to answer this question. Is God an illusion or not? It's truth that interests me. Now, of course, very silly things happen. I was in the Netherlands recently, and I had to debate at the University of Delft, a famous physicist, and in the University of Groningen, a sociologist. And the physicist, who was an atheist, said, "Well, your God is like Santa Claus. Do you have Santa Claus in the Faroes?" "Yes." He's just an illusion, maybe a comfortable illusion, but he's like Santa Claus. Well, that was interesting to hear from a physicist. I got the same from the sociologist in two completely separate cities. I found it very amusing. So I said to the audience, let's test this. How many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as adults? I watched and no hands went up. Then I said, how many of you came to believe in God as adults? And many hands went up. And I said to the two professors separately, I said, please don't be silly. Don't insult me or the audience in suggesting God is like Santa Claus, because it is so obvious he is not. Just at that simple level. And yet, people like Richard Dawkins, from whom this title is taken, is God a delusion? He's written a book called The God Delusion, where he says God is exactly like Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy or leprechauns. Those are little mythical dwarves that live at the bottom of every Irish person's garden. But we'll not go into that. So, what is a delusion? Well, Dawkins defines a delusion reasonably as a persistent false belief that is held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. That is a false belief that people hold strongly when, to everybody else, the evidence seems to point the other way. He claims God is a delusion. I claim atheism is a delusion. So that might provoke a few questions as we go along. Now, the notion that God is a delusion, that Christianity is a delusion, is very old. The famous apostle Paul, who brought Christianity to Europe and eventually to Britain and the Faroe Islands, he was put on trial for his faith in front of King Agrippa and Porcius Festus. And he was making his defense of his experience of God when Festus intervened and said, Paul, much learning is making you mad. You're crazy, old chap. This is delusional. So the accusation is not new. It is very old. And Paul just pointed out that it wasn't a delusion at all. These things have not been done in a corner. There's plenty of evidence, and so on. And I want to consider tonight some of those things. But why do people suggest that God is a delusion? Well, it really goes back to Sigmund Freud, or earlier. But let's take Freud, because he's the person with whom people are most familiar. And the idea that's put out is we wish for comfort. We can't cope with this complex world on our own. We need a father figure. Our human father figures are not big enough. So we need a father figure in the sky. So we invent one. And God is that result of wishful thinking. That is, we created God in our imagination. Now, you've probably heard the question that comes up in Dawkins' book, who made God? If you believe God made the universe, you're going to ask, who made God? We might come to that if you want me to. But the delusional view is that we made God. We made the gods. They are simply human constructs. And they're a product of wishful thinking. Now let's investigate that tonight. Is a thing false because you wish for it? Now, suppose I feel thirsty. I wish for water. There is water. It would be very strange to wish for water in a universe in which water didn't exist, wouldn't it? We have a desire for intimacy. It would be strange to have a wish for that in a universe where it didn't exist. We have a desire to be loved and so on. the fact that I might wish at that level, I might wish for a father figure, is not necessarily evidence that such a figure does not exist. It may well be evidence that he does exist. So let's not knock wishing too quickly. Now, of course, I could wish for something and it doesn't exist. We all do that. Or it's unattainable. But I want to investigate now the next kind of step here. And that is, the atheist says that God is a wish fulfillment. Now, the word delusion is technically a word from psychiatry. Richard Dawkins uses it, but he's not a psychiatrist. I use it, and I'm not a psychiatrist either. So what do you do if you're not a psychiatrist? Well, if you're me, you see what the psychiatrists say. And that's very interesting. Because there is a book, I don't know whether you have it in Faroese. Its title is Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten. I don't even know whether it's in English. It's a German book. A Brief History of the Great One. That is a brief history of God. It's written by one of Germany's most distinguished psychiatrists. And he says this: if there is no God, then Freud's explanation that belief in God is wish fulfillment is very good. It works if there is no God. But then he goes on. And he says, of course, if there is a God, the very same explanation shows that atheism is a wish fulfillment. The desire not to have ever to meet God or to be accountable to him. And Lutz quotes Czesław Miłosz, the Polish Nobel laureate for literature, who once wrote, atheism is the great opium of the people. The desire never to have to give account for our evil, our murders, and so on. So, do you see, the argument works both ways. If there's no God, Freud explains religion, belief in God, as a wish fulfillment. If there is a God, the same argument explains atheism as a wish fulfillment. So where do you go from there? Well, as Lutz says, on the basic question, whether there's a God or not, neither Freud, Jung, or Frankl can help you. Now, this is very important to realize, particularly for the students here, that when I meet a new argument, I look and see, does it work in both directions? And this one does. The Freudian argument doesn't deal with God at all. It misses the main question, which is there a God or is there not a God? And you're going to have to decide that on other bases than wish fulfillment, except that wishing something might be evidence that it is true. On the other hand, it might be evidence that it is false. And a rather funny incident occurred with me, actually, and Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking is the famous physicist in the wheelchair who held until recently Isaac Newton's chair at Cambridge. He was asked about religion. A brief statement about religion, and he said, religion is a fairy story for people who are afraid of the dark. I was asked to comment, and I said, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, you laugh, and that's very kind, but it doesn't prove anything, of course. But you see, the thing can be reversed. So this argument, which Dawkins uses and many other people use, is completely ineffective. It creates a fog. And one of the things I feel very much about this topic, and I feel comfortable because we're surrounded by fog at the moment, is that the major problems in this debate have all to do with intellectual fog and confusion. about relatively simple things and arguments that are being used but not fairly used. And that is one of them. Now, it's very interesting if you pursue this. Let's think again about the question, who created God? The Freudian argument is, we created God. Okay, so let's go on. Who created us? And the answer will be, well, the universe created us. And then I ask the next question, who created the universe? And now we're stuck, aren't we? You see, you don't get out of the difficulty of finding an origin for the universe by adopting the Freudian argument at all. It just means that you have a longer chain to get to it. But you're still facing the same fundamental question. Now, let me just en passant, so to speak, because everybody hears this question. It's the heart of Dawkins' book. I couldn't believe this, but it is. Who created the Creator? If, like me, you believe, and I suspect many of you do, that God created the universe, many atheists say, well, you've then got to answer the question, who created the Creator? And then you've got to answer who created the Creator, that created the Creator, that created the Creator. And so it goes on forever and ever, amen. And it's complete nonsense, so let's forget about it. It doesn't work like that. So let's do a bit of logic, if it's not too late at night. Who created X, or what created X? That question sounds simple, but you'll notice, please, that it assumes X was created. Who or what created X? You're assuming X was created. So if you say who created God, you're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't? Then the question doesn't apply. It's as simple as that. So there's two ways of looking at this. The Dawkins view is, who created God? We did, and he's a fantasy. But that still leads to the question, who created the universe? But if you come the other direction and say, if you believe genuinely that there's a real creator of the universe, and then you say, who created the Creator? You're assuming he was created. But the God of the Bible was not created. He's eternal. He's always existed. So the question doesn't apply to him. This is the heart of Dawkins' argument. I was just amazed. And when I was confronted with him in public, I said to him what I've just said to you. And then I said this, but there's something else I want to say. You, Richard Dawkins, you believe that the universe created you. So let me ask you your question. Who created your Creator? I'm still waiting for the answer, and that was 8 years ago. So once we begin to investigate this, it just disappears. It completely disappears. And it's so important to realize that the Bible has anticipated this centuries ago. Many people today, I find, write the Bible off. They don't know what's in it. They've never read it. They've never thought about it. But just take this. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him. And without him, nothing was made that was made. Well, that's how the English translation reads. It's not quite accurate enough. Because what it actually says is, all things came to be through him. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. In the beginning, the Word was. That is an existence statement. The Word already was. The Word that is God is eternal. There's the central claim. And that gets rid of Dawkins' objection, because if the Word's eternal, he can't talk about the Word being created. But the universe is not eternal. It came to be. That is vastly important, because the ancient Greeks were very interested. Is there anything eternal, or did everything come to be? So John is speaking into that, And he's making a very, very important distinction. He's answering the question, by the way, how do you get something from nothing? How do you get a universe? The physicists tell me the universe came from nothing. And they have a lot of difficulty. You may want to question me about that or to unpack it. But the universe didn't come from nothing. It came from God. But God is not material. So, where are we? What have I been saying? The idea that God is a delusion, that's a psychiatric concept. When we investigate it, we see that we can equally well say the same about atheism. The question doesn't address the basic issue, is there a God or isn't there a God? Now, I did mention psychiatry, and I thought, since Dawkins wasn't a psychiatrist, and nor am I thought I would consult a psychiatrist about this. Now, delusion comes from the Latin word deludere, to play with someone in a mocking way. And it originally meant to deceive the mind or judgment, to cause that which is false to be accepted as true. Today, the word delusion carries with it overtones of psychiatric illness. Now, many psychiatrists have pointed out it's very dangerous to talk about God as a delusion, because you just might be talking to people who have got psychiatric illness, and their belief in God is the thing that keeps them moderately stable. So you need to be very careful and compassionate. Dawkins realizes that delusion is especially a symptom of psychiatric disorder, but he moves away from that. Now, the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Britain is a very prestigious body. It was headed by a man called Andrew Sims. He wrote a book as a psychiatrist called Is Faith Delusional? It is a fascinating book. Now, this is an expert talking. Dawkins isn't an expert, nor am I. So reading what this expert says is fascinating. Listen to this. He has worked for many years in this area. And one of his interests is, does belief in God, does religious belief have a positive or a negative effect on psychological health? Here's his conclusion. The advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality on mental and physical health is one of the best kept secrets in psychiatry and medicine generally. If the findings of the huge volume of research on this topic had gone in the opposite direction, and if it had been found, therefore, that religion damages your mental health, it would have been front-page news in every newspaper in the world. That is a staggering statement. Now, Dawkins claims to be using science. Here's a psychiatric scientist, and he's saying the exact opposite. There is no mention in Dawkins' book or any of the other books that I know of this huge volume of research. They don't even know of its existence. So they're not intellectuals, ladies and gentlemen. I can't take that seriously, to be quite honest. When people are ignorant of the research in a topic that they claim to be quoting. And Sims points out, in the majority of studies, and he's quoting now a secular study. This is a quote from the American Journal of Public Health. In the majority of studies, there's a correlation between religious belief involvement with well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, hope, optimism, purpose, meaning in life, better adaptation to bereavement, lower rates of depression, faster recovery from depression, lower rates of suicide, less psychosis, lower rates of alcohol and drug abuse, greater marital stability, and on and on and on and on. That's very impressive, isn't it? Even at the level of medical research into well-being, which is a very important topic in many universities today, there's a strong relationship between belief in God and positive mental health. Where's that mentioned in the God delusion? Nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. And I don't find that a bit impressive. So it seems to me that he sums up his position. He says the statement that all religious belief is delusion is both wrong and innately hostile because of the danger of its effect on people who suffer from some kind of psychiatric illness. The suggestion, I quote, that faith is delusional does not help psychiatric patients for whom the religious faith may be very important. So, when we start to see exactly what the true position is, the idea that God is a delusion evaporates. The psychological argument simply disappears. Now, I want to argue just for a few more minutes, because I'm much more interested in hearing what you have to say, is that atheism is a delusion in the exact sense that it's a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. Now, why do I say that? Well, let me give you one of the main reasons. And it comes from science, really. You see, one of the delusions of atheism is that they are completely deluded about the nature of faith. Let me repeat that. There's a delusion about the nature of faith. Because Richard Dawkins and others think that faith means believing where there's no evidence. That's what they think. That has had such an effect that it's now in one of America's leading dictionaries, Webster's Dictionary. There's an entry now in it, faith, noun, believing where there's no evidence. So they meet me. I am, they say, a man of faith. That's an insult. Because what they think that means is, I believe where there's no evidence, so there's no point in talking to me. Now, this is delusional. It's very dangerous. It's a false belief held in the face of strong, contradictory evidence. What is the strong, contradictory evidence? It's just looking at a dictionary. Looking at any sensible dictionary, you will find that faith in English comes from the Latin fides, which means trust. We get our word fidelity from it. And the cognate words, faith, belief, trust, it's the same in the New Testament. So that if I say I trust something or I trust someone, the next logical question is, on what basis do you trust them? You all understand that. The banking crisis affected the Faroes, didn't it? We thought we could trust some of the banks. Do you remember that? We had faith. It was a bit blind. And then, when the basis for faith disappeared, the markets froze. Do you remember that? And they could only get going again when confidence was restored. Everybody in the West understands what evidence-based trust is. Now, this is crucial, ladies and gentlemen. I speak now as a Christian. Other belief system must speak for themselves, but Christianity is an evidence-based faith. You can see that very clearly from John's Gospel, where towards the end he says why he wrote it. many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written in order that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence. All these things that Jesus did are signs, they're pointers, they're evidence to help you understand and trust that he is who he claimed to be, the Son of God. Christianity is an evidence-based faith. Now, the philosophers have contradicted that. There's a famous philosopher in England called A.C. Grayling, who ought to know better. But he says, oh, no. Jesus expects people to trust him without any evidence. And when I first heard that, I thought, this is going to be very interesting. On what is he going to base this? And to my utter amazement, he based it on the story of doubting Thomas. Have you all heard of doubting Thomas? Thomas was a disciple who wasn't present when Jesus showed the others that he had risen from the dead. And Thomas met them and says, I'm not going to believe until I see the evidence. And Jesus suddenly appeared, showed him the evidence. And Thomas fell at his feet and worshipped him as the Son of God. And Jesus then said this, Thomas, because you have seen, you have believed. Happy are those who have not seen and yet believe. And there's this philosopher Grayling. Jesus said you've got to believe without evidence. And I say, can he not read? Jesus did not say, because you have seen, you have believed, blessed are those who have had no evidence and yet believe. He said, blessed are those who have not seen. I've not seen Jesus in the same way that Thomas did. Seeing is only one part of evidence. Do you only believe the things you see? Well, you never believe in gravity for a start. Well, you understand what I mean. This is silly reasoning. Jesus is making the very important point that marvelous for Thomas, he actually saw. But that's not the only evidence that's going to be supplied. And millions of people have come to believe in Jesus, like I have, and some of you have. They've never seen, but they've got piles of evidence in history, in their own experience, in logic, in argument, in the universe, and so on. Christianity is an evidence-based faith. Now, the new atheists have a delusional definition of faith, which serves them well. And they've convinced the public of it. I have many colleagues in Oxford, and I cannot get them to see that faith, if it's worth talking about, has to be evidence-based. Now, here comes the bigger problem. Because of this delusional definition of faith, it obscures from people like Richard Dawkins the very important role faith plays in science. You see, he writes, atheists have no faith. And then he writes a book about what he believes. This is silly. And it was brought to my attention in a hilarious way. And it relates to what we're talking about. So I'll tell you, would you like a story? Let me tell you a story. I debated the famous Peter Singer, who's the world's most eminent bioethicist from Princeton University. But Peter's Australian, and so I debated him in Australia. And I told the audience, honestly, like I've told you tonight, my parents are Christians, so on and so on. So he stood up and he said, well, he said, there you are. He said, that's my biggest objection to religion. People stay in the religion in the faith in which they're brought up. So that's it. It's just a delusion. That's all it is. So I thought this is going to be very interesting. So when I got the chance to speak, I said, Peter, I told the audience about my parents. Why don't you tell them about yours? For instance, were your parents atheists? He said, yes. Oh, I said, so you have remained in the faith in which you were brought up. Oh, but he said, it's not a faith. Oh, I said, sorry, Peter, I thought you believed it. Now, cyberspace went wild at that point. Here was one of the world's top philosophers who doesn't understand that his atheism is a belief system. That's staggering, but that's the effect of a delusional definition of faith. So it's serious, it's very serious. We have to combat it. The next step is this: faith and science. How is faith involved in science? At the most basic level of all. I'm a scientist. Why would I do science? I believe it can be done. I have faith that it can be done. I have confidence that it can be done. Now, we are heirs of the work of Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Clerk Maxwell, and all these brilliant people. All the names I have mentioned were Christian of one sort or another. They all believed in God. This is so important because belief in God is the foundation of modern science. That's why I'm not embarrassed or ashamed to be both a scientist and a Christian, because Christianity gave me my subject. C.S. Lewis put it brilliantly and very well when he said, men became scientific. I'm sorry, ladies, it was only men in those days. There are some wonderful women scientists these days, but then it was only men. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in the lawgiver. So there's a relationship between faith in God and science. That's where it came from, you see. So here we have this fascinating situation where now they're telling us you don't need God. So here's what happens. I have these conversations in Oxford, and they're terrific fun. I pick a colleague and I say, tell me, what do you do science with? Oh, they say, my department gave me £1 million and I've got this wonderful piece of equipment. I said, I don't mean that, I mean this. Oh, that? You mean that? I said, yes, what's that? Well, it's my brain, because many of them don't believe in the mind. I do, actually, but that's another story. I do science with my brain. Oh, really? Tell me about your brain. Well, they say, do you want the long story? No, I want the short story. Well, what's the short story about the brain? What's its origin? Well, basically it's this. The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I say, and you trust it. You trust it. Here's an iPad or a computer. If you knew that that was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? Not for a second. Now, here's the problem, ladies and gentlemen. If you get rid of God, you've got a big problem here. You see, Einstein said he couldn't imagine a scientist without faith. Not faith in God. Faith, trust that the universe can be accessed by the human mind. And then Darwin comes along and he said, I sometimes wonder, if the human mind, which I believe has been descended from lower minds, can be at all reliable. I mean, after all, what is there in a monkey's mind? Could you trust it? This is what Darwin said, not me. And the very interesting thing now is this has taken a massive leap into center stage. C.S. Lewis saw it in the 1940s, but people didn't grasp it enough, or not enough people grasped it. C.S. Lewis said very brilliantly, but then he was very brilliant. I used to listen to him. In 1962, I heard the very last lectures he gave, and I'm so glad I did, because his thinking has helped me immeasurably. C.S. Lewis said, we do science. We think about the universe, but we haven't thought about thinking. And the moment you start to think about thinking, and ask the question, is thinking valid? Because if thinking isn't valid, all of science disappears. And you see, I'm told by people like Dawkins, that thinking is done biomechanism that's the end product of a mindless, unguided process that undermines any rational belief and thinking. Now, it would be all right for me to say that. Nobody would listen. But one of the world's leading philosophers has just stepped into center stage, and he's an atheist, and he's saying it. And that's a very different thing. His name, for those of you who are interested, is Thomas Nagel. Nagel. And Thomas Nagel has written a book called Mind and Cosmos. Its subtitle is explosive. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. His argument is simply this. If you account for thought by purely natural, unguided forces, you remove all possible meaning from it. You see, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that atheism is the great delusion, because in the end, following this logically, it abolishes the very rationality that we need to do science at all. I've just been in Australia, as I mentioned, and I've been giving lectures on cosmic chemistry, do science and God mix? But at the conclusion of those lectures, I said, well, actually, science and God mix perfectly. Atheism and science don't mix at all. That's got nothing to do with God at all. You see, one of my main reasons for saying that atheism is a delusion is not because I'm a Christian, it's because I'm a scientist. My Christianity gives me reason for trusting my mind. Atheism removes it. Now, which am I going to believe as a scientist? Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? So that's a little beginning into our subject. And I thank you very much indeed for being so patient with me. I have one more thing to say though, and it's this. When it comes to God, when all the discussion is done, Richard Dawkins, in his book again, God Delusion, says that God is no explanation of anything. Because God is more complicated than the thing you're explaining. So that can't be an explanation. That sounds very impressive, doesn't it? Until you investigate it. So I said to Richard Dawkins, I've read a book called The God Delusion. It's quite complicated. It's about 400 pages long. And I asked what is its origin, and somebody tells me, well, it originated in the much more complicated mind of Richard Dawkins. So I reject that explanation. That cannot be true. Because that explanation is more complex than the thing you're explaining. Isn't it? Now this is very important. Why? Because we're taught at school and university that real explanation always moves from the simple to the complex. It often does. That's, in other words, what we call reductionism. You reduce something that's complex to something simple. And when you can do that, it's marvelous. We do that all the time, of course. If we've got a complex problem, we try and split it up, solve the smaller problems, and hope they give us insight on the big one. But there is one area where it never works. That's where language is involved. Language that is meaning. You look at 4 words up on that screen. Gud ein villleiðing, or something like that. Now, the moment you see that, you infer that there's a mind behind it, don't you? Immediately. Because it means something to you. Now, there are many mechanical and automatic processes that are producing that. Blind processes. The computer and the beamer out of which that is coming have no minds at all. They're totally automatic. But you know, the moment you see language, that mind has been involved somewhere. Yes? Now here's the fun. Even if you just had the first 2 words, Gud, with 5 letters, you'd know that a mind was behind it. Any scientist will say there's a mind behind it. Well, I'd say to them, you go into your laboratory and you look at the genetic code and you see a strand of DNA 3.5 billion letters long, the longest word we've ever discovered. Perfect order in a 4-letter chemical alphabet. And you talk about the code. It's coding for something. It's got meaning. It's semiotic, just like that is. And I say, where did that come from? And they say, chance and the laws of nature. What? Even if it was a black box and we knew nothing about it. It's logos, ladies and gentlemen. And one of the main reasons I think atheism is a delusion is that in our universe we have lived to see. My generation is the first generation to see this. That in every one of the 10 trillion cells of your body, there's the longest word we've ever discovered. That science is discovered. The Bible, the New Testament written 20 centuries ago, says in the beginning was the Word. They match, of course, don't they? This is a word-based universe. Life is word-based. And therefore, it seems to me, the universe is not neutral. Even in its intricate detail, at all of its levels, it's describable in terms of the most sophisticated language we've ever invented, mathematics. Its laws are mathematical. We are not only based on a genetic text, we can produce text, we can speak, we can communicate, we can use language. All of that, to me, points in one direction alone. In the beginning was the Word. Science now, many scientists, not science, say it all came from nothing. You've got to choose which makes more sense. The infinite eternal Word or nothing. You choose. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.